The International Monetary Fund is backing U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen's call for a global minimum corporate tax rate. Now, Yellen is pushing for a 28% corporate tax rate to help pay for all of the Biden administration's stimulus and spending, and she wants other G20 countries to follow suit. Now, Yellen is getting support from the IMF, saying it has long favored adoption of a global minimum tax on corporate profits. The IMF's chief economist saying that the current disparities in national corporate tax rates have triggered a, quote, large amount of tax shifting and tax avoidance, which only serves to reduce the tax base for all governments that could otherwise be collecting revenues to fund needed economic and social spending. And the French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, is also backing this, saying that a global deal on cross-border taxation was certainly within reach. So, Rick, do you see this happening? Do you think Janet Yellen and the IMF can get this global corporate minimum tax rate?
Yes, I think it's despicable. I think it's dangerous. I think it constrains investment. I think it encourages malinvestment by governments. I think it's worse than bad. And I think it's going to happen. This isn't about equity. Let's get this straight. This is about envy. This is about the way decisions are made in society. Corporations need to convince their consumers to buy from them. Governments can coerce and compel. And to the extent that governments have the ability to extend their ability to coerce across borders, they will do it. This is simply about less freedom and more centralized control. The big thinkers of the world, the IMF, the elected politicians, don't deal in utility. They don't have to convince their customers. They deal in raw power. And this is about raw power. This is about making the world a better place for them and a less good place for everyone else. I think I was fairly clear about that, wasn't I?
Tell us how you really feel, Rick. No, but the issue here, Rick, though, is how do you get the other countries to go along? Because for this to work, you can't have the US raising its tax rate and another country maintaining it lower, because obviously then they become more attractive to investors and to corporations, and they'll just move over there. So how does the US and even the IMF coerce at least the G20 to go along with it?
I don't think they'll have any problem with the G20. They may have a problem with Switzerland, but remember that the US government could simply change the tax code with regards to unrepatriated foreign profits. At present, there are rather large exemptions for US companies that hold profits that were generated overseas. In other words, not taxing them until they return the money home. The United States government is so powerful and the US economy is so powerful that the United States could act almost unilaterally with regards to US taxpayers, irrespective of what other G20 countries did. It's ironic that probably the only hope for free people is in places like Russia or China. It's ironic that in terms of private capital, the communist totalitarian countries are much more free than the West. I don't think that you will have a problem achieving tax harmony in the biggest economies of the world, because I think the big thinkers, which are in fact the people who coerce rather than convince, are on the ascent in those countries.
So just by threatening to make changes to tax repatriation, you think that that is sufficient leverage for the US, for Treasury Secretary Yellen to get everybody to comply with a global or at least G20 minimum corporate tax rate of around 28%?
Yeah, I think in particular, the EU was looking for the United States to come up to 28. In other words, I think the world's roof on this is the United States. And I think that I think it's very, very, very unfortunate. Don't get me wrong. But I think that the big thinkers, as I derisively call them, are looking for U.S. leadership in this regard. They would like to drain decision-making from the private sector and expand decision-making in the public sector. I believe this is wrong. I believe it'll constrain economic growth. I think it'll constrain individual freedom, all those things. I think it's going to happen anyway.
Well, do you think that there could be some kind of pushback from the private sector?
I think there will be. And I think that that pushback will be effective 5 years from now or 6 years from now.
Okay.
The problem is right now. My fear is H.L. Mencken once said, the voters almost always get what they deserve, usually good and hard. And I think that this will be a circumstance where that happens. I think that there's a populist push worldwide against the private sector, against the sector that has to convince, and a worldwide push in favor of those who coerce and compel. Things go in and out of fashion. And I think when the dangerous nature of that becomes apparent or more apparent to taxpayers, that the pendulum will swing back. But in the near term, I think the pendulum is swinging quickly the other way, in favor of the IMF.
How quickly, Rick? Because, I like to push you on timelines, but how soon do you think they'll be able to institute this corporate minimum tax?
I would be surprised if they didn't get it done by 2023.
Wow, that is very soon.
I mean, it will be an ugly fight in the U.S. Don't get me wrong. It'll be an ugly fight. And Biden, when he looks at fundraising for the interim elections, which comes from, rich people from Wall Street, it may be that the people who normally write a check for political protection will see that they're not being protected. If you combine the corporate minimum tax of 28% with the idea that you would tax as ordinary income, the carried interest in capital gains that Wall Street is so fond of, it might be that the money will talk and the big thinkers will have to back off. We'll just see.
Well, I do want to focus on the two potential outliers that you mentioned, Russia and China. I mean, do you see China going along with this global corporate tax rate minimum? I don't. So what happens then?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how many global investors would decide, as an example, to redomicile in China or redomicile in Hong Kong. Certainly, I remember reading in the Vancouver paper 4 or 5 years ago about a Chinese-Canadian businessman who went from Vancouver to China and said, from a business point of view, communist China is much freer than Canada. Perhaps that decision would be writ large, or perhaps Russia or Liechtenstein or Switzerland would become viable alternatives. But I think the whole world's going to be looking at the whole world. I think the whole solvent world is going to be looking for alternatives.
Yes. And then again, it would just serve to disadvantage the United States and the other countries that offer a higher tax rate. I mean, doesn't that just go and drive all this business to China and Russia? Hopefully.
I mean, that's all I can say. Hopefully. I hope that tax competition continues. The only ability that free people have against coercion is the ability to relocate either their carcass or their assets to places where their freedom is protected more. And, my hope is that some society decides to be competitive relative to the big thinker and provides a haven for capital and for people. I'm just in the near term pessimistic about that. The roof, if you will, the political and economic roof in terms of that type of freedom has been the United States. And with that roof, if you will, being raised on behalf of the IMF, it seems pretty dire to me. Very dire indeed. The question is, will China be able to get away with keeping a lower corporate tax rate with the other countries not
coercing it to go along through economic sanctions, through other measures. And as you say, it's ironic that China may be the bastion of economic freedom when it comes to corporate tax rates.
It is interesting. It's an irony that makes me laugh. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that corporations relocate to China
right.
wholesale. There is certainly other aspects of their political system that are extraordinarily coercive. It's just with regards to tax that they may offer alternatives to people. The Chinese in the last 5 years, and I'm no political scientist, but the Chinese have seemed relatively immune to coercion by foreigners. And the Russians, too, have been less immune, as have smaller jurisdictions like the United Arab Emirates and Singapore, which have offered up, I think, some advantages to independent business people globally. And hopefully those exceptions remain strong enough that the G20 doesn't have the ability to, as I would call it, increase the level of extortion.
Well, as part of its efforts for global dominance, Beijing is now launching its version of a digital currency. In fact, it's the first major economy to do so. The digital yuan is going to be controlled by China's central bank, the People's Bank of China. It will still circulate alongside conventional bills and coins, and it's expected to give Beijing new tools to monitor the economy and the people. And it's also positioning the digital yuan or renminbi for international use, designing for it to be unlinked to the global financial system. So, Rick, do you think that this digitized money out of China could now reorder the fundamentals of finance?
I think certainly the blockchain technology and digital technology will alter the global financial system. Whether or not the Chinese effort is the catalyst to do that is a very different question. One of the advantages that digital currency has right now is, at least with regards to Bitcoin as an example, that you don't have to trust your own central bank. And obviously, the Chinese are employing a digital yuan for a very different reason, because they want to control things. They want, as an example, to be able to cancel somebody's currency who is a bad actor. But certainly the ability to eliminate cash is something that, from a government's point of view, is a great thing. From a citizen's point of view, is a horrific thing. The essentially frictionless nature of digital currency, which is to say the fact that there's no issuance cost, that there's no transaction cost, theoretically, that it's very traceable, that it's very assignable, is great. The fact that you could run your whole financial life from your phone, assuming that you don't lose your phone and lose your password, all those things are great. And I think that's the way that the world is going. I'm not so sure what the adoption on a global basis of a digital yuan will be. I know some years ago, and I don't want to name the country, but I was talking to an investment manager from a very large parastatal pension fund in Asia about their holdings of U.S. treasuries, talking about the relatively low yield that they received on their U.S. treasuries relative to the inflation rate. And I asked him what he thought about U.S. treasuries. Did he trust the U.S. government? And he says, "Oh, no, but we trust you far more than we trust each other." And then, as I pressed him a little further, I said, a U.S. 30-year treasury, given the unfunded obligations of the U.S. government, doesn't this feel sort of like a lie to you? And he said, "Yes, absolutely, but a deep and liquid lie, unlike other sovereign lies." And so my hesitancy in terms of agreeing with you goes not so much to the digital technology, but rather to other countries' fondness still for the deeper and more liquid US dollar relative to the yuan, including, by the way, the Chinese.
So it's all relative, sort of the
Correct.
Cleanest shirt in the dirty laundry hamper analogy. The lesser of all evils. But look, Rick, one of the concerns here with this digital yuan is that it could give those that are trying to get away from U.S. sanctions a way out, that this could be an alternative sort of network, that exchanges wouldn't need to use SWIFT, the messaging network, for example, that's used in trade transfers between commercial banks, that this could be a chance to weaken the power of American sanctions, and that there's a whole crowd that's going to be very excited about that and would participate in a system that takes away the US's ability to penalize money exchanges.
Well, I think a multipolar world is probably a safer world, so I think that's a good thing. It's just that the Chinese government hasn't been immune themselves to attempting to coerce people to their own policy initiatives. I'm not sure that, as an example, the Iranians, or in particular, the Russians, would trust the Chinese any more than they trust the Americans. I think you'll see more and more bilateral relationships that maybe are able to avoid the SWIFT system. I certainly, were I Iranian, would be looking for a way around the SWIFT. I'm just not sure that an ascendant militaristic China would be my first choice, as you point out, or the cleanest shirt in a very dirty laundry. I think the United States dollar, and in particular the transparency of the U.S. system relative to the opaqueness of the Chinese system, means that the yuan for a substantial period of time is going to be an also ran at best, irrespective of the stupidity of the American political elite.
All right. So the good news is that you don't necessarily see this as a challenge to dollar dominance, but not because the U.S. government knows what it's doing, is what you're saying.
That's correct. That's correct. I'm sorry to sound like such a cynic, but you've asked me these big picture questions about government that bring out the cynic in me.
Well, Rick, now that you've retired, you have a lot more time on your hands. Would you even contemplate perhaps taking up some kind of position in government, Treasury Secretary, perhaps a Fed chair? Should that option be available to you, and showing them how to run things?
If elected, I would demand an immediate recount. I'm happy. I'm happy as an investor. I'm happy as a speculator. I'm happy helping people voluntarily increase their own wealth in non-coercive environments. No future for me in public politics.
And Rick, because we know you like to help investors, and particularly Kitco viewers, you have an offer to help rank their portfolios.
I've enjoyed in the past communicating with Kitco customers, and I like to incent them to do it. Anyone listening to this interview can go to sprottusa.com/rankings, enter your natural resource portfolio, and I will rank those companies 1 to 10, 1 being best, 10 being worst. I'll comment on individual companies where I think my comments might have interest. And I will send you, if you ask for charts, the Barron's Gold Mining Index chart, which is the best pictorial representation of gold bull markets over the last 50 years that I've seen. And I will also send a 100-year commodity chart that talks about the very recovery that you were describing, Michelle, in the context of 100 years of relative pricing between commodities and other investment assets. Once again, sprottusa.com/rankings.
We will put that on the screen. Thank you so much for that gracious offer to our viewers. And again, we'll do a follow-up on that. But in the meantime, Rick, thank you again so much for joining us. Rick Rule.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this process. I look forward to doing it again.
Likewise. And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm Michelle McCory. Stay tuned for more.